Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director of Carolina Public Humanities, and I'm delighted to welcome you to day 2 of the Adams Symposium for the Humanities. Thank you, Paul Bonici, for getting this event running and for the continued thematic music. I just want to point out, lineman, that's a pretty good salary these days. At any rate, we'll talk more about different types of jobs throughout the day. I want to start today's proceedings by thanking Dr. Anderson for her wonderful presentation last night and for the generous engagement with our participants. We had a great conversation with lots of questions, in fact, a surplus of questions. So we want to thank all of you out there for doing your work as well, for joining. And please take part today. Use that question and answer button at the bottom of your screen because we're going to have a great conversation today. I also want to reiterate Carolina Public Humanities thanks to the Taylor Charitable Trust for supporting this symposium and all the initiatives we have undertaken to promote the legacy and continue the work of our founder, E. Maynard Adams. We miss you in person, Taylors, down there in Alabama, and we look forward to doing this live again here in Chapel Hill next year. We are also grateful for the College of Arts and Sciences support, as well as the support of the Department of Philosophy, our dear friends in the philosophy department who help us organize all of these Adams initiatives. This morning, we'll have an opportunity to listen to scholarly responses from the Carolina community addressing Professor Anderson's presentation, but we start by situating our topic, the work ethic, within our founder Maynard Adams' ideas on work, labor, and life. And we have two wonderful presenters to help us do that. Professor of Law Emerita from the University of Southern Illinois, Jill Adams, daughter of Maynard, and Carl Adam. By the way, that last name is just a coincidence. One of this year's Adams Fellows and a PhD candidate in philosophy. As Lloyd mentioned last night, Maynard Adams was the founder of the program in the Humanities and Human Values, now Carolina Public Humanities. And those familiar with Maynard Adams' ideas know that he believed and supported with logic the idea that emotions are knowledge yielding. They are not mere distractions from the truths that emerge through rational thought and a naturalist or scientific worldview. Adams posited that underneath a person's sense of how the world ought to be lay deep truths about the nature of reality. This realization of what ought to be, Adams contended, comes to us through feeling, not calculation, and yet can reveal truths that may guide our ethical choices and even understand metaphysical reality. Well, this idea has not been widely accepted or adopted by the philosophical community, but it could be seen in the way he lived his life and dedicated his work to make a better world, a world that's characterized by the title of his last book, A Society Fit for Human Beings, a place where what ought to be will be. But that will take work, and as we'll see, it takes education as well. So as we think about work and the work ethic more this morning, let's keep this core concept of Adams in mind. Millions of people stuck in jobs that we learned last night have a distinctive name, might have a sense of how work ought to be, and in that emotional response to their situations, they may indeed be touching on a fundamental truth. Now, this is all quite abstract, but I can assure you that Adams was not just a thinker, he was a dedicated public humanist who observed the world as it was and shared practical ideas for building and nurturing that society fit for human beings. So we're excited to learn a bit more about how Maynard thought about work, the work ethic, and the role of labor in society, and also what it was like to work and live with such a hard worker. And to start us off, we're really delighted to welcome back to, at least virtually welcome back to Chapel Hill, our dear friend Jill Adams, daughter of Maynard Adams, who can tell us a little bit about Maynard and the work ethic. So welcome, Jill. Let's see if we can pull Jill's camera up. There she is. All right, take it away, Jill. We're in your hands. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Max. I'm not going to speak long, but I'll speak briefly about my dad. And I'd like to, first of all, thank Crawford Taylor and the Taylor Family Charitable Trust for making this possible. I think this inquiry into the nature of work would be very central to what my dad viewed as part of the necessary cultural criticism that needed to take place for a humanistic world structure that would create a society fit for human beings. And I think I thank Dr. Anderson for her comments last night. I think that would be very much in line with much of what my father would want to say. I used to carry a photograph of my dad. Unfortunately, it was in a wallet that got stolen when I was in my early 20s. But he grew up on a tobacco farm in Virginia. He lived in a house without running water, without electricity, and farming was very much the family enterprise. This photograph I had of him showed him in a field with bib overalls on, a straw hat, and he's standing in the tobacco field. And he assured me the picture was not taken to preserve his image, because that wouldn't have mattered. But the tobacco was over his head, and that was worth preserving. And he was there to give proportion to the tobacco. Most of us have had jobs that we've taken to get by. When I was at UNC as an undergraduate, for a while, I pulled those computer cards to match students with classes when they used to schedule by having to go around Woolen Gym and pull out a card, a punch card with a particular class on it. And there were so many for each class, and the class would close out. My dad never had that. His work was always vocation. There was one summer, 1938, when he worked as a surveyor for the US Agricultural Department. But I think that is the closest he ever came to having a job just to put money in his pocket. He grew up working on the farm. He said that his childhood really ended when he was 6, when he became a field hand. Even though it was a world of work, it was very meaningful because it was part of what the family did. He was a contributor to the family enterprise, and that gave him a sense of value. As he grew older, he found some contradictions in the work, particularly about growing tobacco, which his parents were very clear he should never smoke or chew, and which he was clear were from his parents that it was not moral to smoke or chew, but they grew it anyway. And he struggled with that and actually said that, along with the contradictions about race in his church, were a lot of what drove him into philosophy. But even though he worried about being engaged in economic activity that did not have a good purpose in the world, the growing of tobacco, the enmeshment with family, with the family enterprise, was deeply meaningful. When he went to college, he worked as a minister. He had 2 churches all through his undergraduate years, maybe not his freshman year, but after his freshman year. He was the minister of 2 churches in Richmond, Virginia. When he went to seminary at Collegiate, Rochester, he again had churches because originally he had planned to be a minister and had a calling to do that. But he found his concerns about the culture and the contradictions in the culture drew him eventually away from the ministry and to college and to philosophy. But his involvement with philosophy was also very much a calling. He felt like if he didn't change the world, he hadn't done his job. And I don't know that he succeeded in changing the world, but I think the Carolina Public Humanities and this kind of symposium very much is in the attempt to change the world that he would want to embrace. And what he taught at the university before the Age Discrimination in Employment Act applied to faculty. So he was required to retire at 70. And it was very hard for him to retire. He did not want to retire. He sought out opportunities to teach. He wrote 5 books, I think, after he retired. He woke up at 4 every morning and went down to the basement to get some quiet time to work before there was interruption. It was a basement he had hand dug under our ranch house with a pickaxe and shovel. So he had physical work as part of his work too. He was always looking for a study, I think. So work was very much a part of what he did. I mean, as he said, play was not part of his growing up after he was about 6. He said his dad always promised to take them fishing, but never did because the work of the farm was always too demanding. And even though there were the contradictions of growing tobacco, the farm stayed with him all of his life. His family sold it in the mid-40s before I was born. But we would go back there, even though he didn't know the current owners. And he would knock on the door and say, I grew up here. Can we walk the fields? And it was important for him to show that to me, and later even to show it to my children. So walking that farm stayed part of our life. And it was that very deep sense of engagement, of being in a community enterprise with his family and contributing to that, that made the farm so important to him. In his last book, A Society Fit for Human Beings, he wrote about the nature of work a good bit. And one of the stories he tells in that is of a janitor for Caldwell Hall, the home of the philosophy department, when he was there, and still the home of the philosophy department. He talked about the fact that Caldwell Hall had the same janitor for about 25 years. Our building was his building. He knew the professors, secretaries, and graduate students personally. He chatted with us on a daily basis. He came to our departmental parties. We recognized his birthdays and kept up with the news about his family and so forth. He identified with us and with his work. He took great pride in keeping the building neat and clean and the furniture and floors shining. He loved his job and was happy in his work. The management of the janitorial services decided that having janitors assigned to particular buildings was not efficient. They organized janitorial teams that would go from building to building, working from 4 o'clock in the morning to noon. They made time studies and assigned people to specialized chores. No one any longer had identification with a particular building or with the people whom they were serving. There were supervisors telling them what to do and writing evaluations on their performance. Our janitor of 25 years no longer loved his job and no longer took pride in his work. He soon took an early retirement. Whatever efficiency in terms of work hours and wages may have been achieved, but I doubt that it was much, the meaningfulness of the work was destroyed and the quality of the work deteriorated. He very much believed there had to be meaningful work and that it could come from community and recognition and sense of pride. It could come from the nature of the work itself, but it also had to embrace the person and not just see them as an economic commodity. And with that, I will end.
Thank you so much for that, Jill. Absolutely. We heard legendary stories about your father's work ethic, and I'm glad you mentioned, as someone, I think someone called it Maynard's Folly, the basement, the legendary hard work done after hours to make a basement in this hard soil of Chapel Hill. Thank you so much for that. You really brought the spirit of Maynard into this, and certainly I'm glad we mentioned the Society Fit for Human Beings, because it's clear that work was a central part of that. Thank you for that. Now let's turn. We're delighted to welcome Carl Adam. He is an Adams Fellow, where again, we're just hitting the Adams word heavy here today. And Carl Adam, we've asked Carl to do a little bit of extra reading of Maynard Adams and to talk a little bit about what struck Carl about Maynard Adams and his ideas about labor. So we're going to just let Carl take it away and take it away. Carl Adam, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Max, for the introduction. I'd like to start by thanking the Adams family and also the other donors who fund the Adams Fellowship for, well, funding the fellowship that I get to enjoy and be a part of this event because of. So I've been asked to say something about the philosophy of Maynard Adams, and Maynard Adams wrote 6 books as a single author, co-wrote several other books, over 100 journal articles. So anything I say is only going to be scratching the surface. I also haven't read all 6 books and several co-written books and 100 journal articles. So that's partly due to me, but also partly because I have a few minutes here. And by all accounts, Professor Adams's work is all interconnected. He's what we call a systematic philosopher. And so he worked in philosophy of religion, ethics, political philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, logic, and all of these ideas were tied together. So there's no way that I can really do justice to the whole system. So what I'm going to do instead is just highlight a couple things that I think are relevant to Professor Anderson's talk from last night. So Adams saw philosophy, at least one primary purpose of philosophy, as a kind of cultural criticism. And one of the things that he talked about and critiqued in modern Western culture was what he called naturalism. Now, as the philosophers in the audience know, that word naturalism in philosophy gets used to mean many different things. The sense of it that he talked about in the work that I'm going to discuss here, I would be tempted to call scientism. So it's this idea that all of the truths and facts are ones that can be discovered by the natural sciences. Now, Adams thought that, of course, the things that can be discovered by the natural sciences are very important, but this leaves out 2 sort of important realms of truth and human experience, and these are meaning and value. And he thought that there was a reason that we tend to think that the important facts, or really all the facts, are natural scientific ones, things about the material world. And that is because, as he wrote, bourgeois life is governed and dominated by concern for our materialistic needs and the quest for the kind of power over nature and society that enables us to satisfy them. Now, of course, materialistic needs are important. If we follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of them are at the bottom, things that we need before we can enjoy other things, right? Food, shelter, these sorts of things. So Adams was far from trying to reject that this is important, but he thought it was incomplete and that we needed a balance. But because of the sort of cultural focus on materialistic needs, that led to the dominance of the sciences, which combined with technology are what enables us to meet those. Adams wrote a long time before the development of the acronym STEM, at least as far as I know, and the emphasis of that. But I think what he was talking about is very much true today when we think about education and the kinds of things that are valued in society, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so these leave out other kinds of important things. We heard from Jill just a moment ago about his thoughts on the importance of meaningful work. And because of this sort of focus on materialistic needs, the things that we teach people when we educate them tend to be always pushed in the direction of what he called narrowly vocational education, right? So what do you need to do? You need to be able to get a job. Why do you need a job? Well, you need a job so that you can get money to satisfy your materialistic needs. And also, from a social perspective, we need people doing work. We need people producing things, even services. We tend to talk about companies having a product, even when that product is a service. And so this is what is valued, and this is what we try to push people into. And there's a sort of constant pressure. And Adams thought that one of the important parts of education was not just the sort of narrow vocational education. Of course, it is important to be able to support yourself. It is important to be able to contribute to society, but also the kind of cultural literacy and critical reasoning skills and things that are needed to help people find meaning in life, help people make good value judgments. So relating this back to the talk last night, Professor Anderson talked a lot about socially necessary labor. And I think Adams's way of extending that point would be to say, well, what does a society need? So I heard a lot from Professor Anderson about things that society does not need, the bullshit jobs. But I think Adams would say that one of the things that we do need is to sort of go beyond this focus on work as meeting people's needs, and you live in order to work, and the point of the work is to meet people's materialistic needs, and to give people the tools to have, in addition to the work, a life outside of that, and the ability to, find meaning, whether that's in their work, hopefully, and also in other things. And so I think that this is a really powerful critique of the kinds of focus that we have in education today, and also in the culture more broadly. So this, of course, is just barely scratching the surface of some ideas that Adams had, but I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to share them with you today. And I look forward to the panel discussion that we'll have in a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Carl. You remind us how much Maynard was contending, although, talking about these issues in the 70s and 80s, how much of these things have remained the pressures of education that he was already seeing. I think Maynard might be shocked by how much that has moved continually in this direction. This is the end of our first little section here. I want to invite Dr. Anderson to respond to these comments as well in the panel session. And of course, if anyone has any questions related to Maynard Adams' ideas about work, feel free to put those in the question and answer session as well. We're going to take about a 5-minute break now to bring in the panelists who are going to respond to Dr. Anderson. And then Dr. Anderson will have a chance to respond to those. So everyone hold tight for a few minutes. We'll have some good music for about 5 minutes here. And we'll pull our panelists back in and enjoy round 2 of the Maynard Adams Symposium. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's great to be with you. We'll see you in just a few minutes.
All right, well, I hope everyone had a good break. And a huge thank you to Max, to Jill, and to Carl for those thankful words. I'd love to invite on our 4 panelists here to get us started on this second phase of the conversation. So I'm Joanna Sirksmith, Associate Director for State Outreach at Carolina Public Humanities, and I'm so pleased to be helping to facilitate today's continuation of last evening's conversation and to pick up on some of the key questions and themes that emerged in last night's keynote address. So tonight we are joined, or this morning rather, we are joined by 4 additional voices, 4 panelists from different disciplines at UNC Chapel Hill to hear their responses to Dr. Anderson's lecture. And I'd like to go through and introduce all 4 of our panelists here, and then we'll hear from each one of them individually, get a chance to hear Elizabeth Anderson's response to the themes that they draw out, and then we will be able to open this up to a lengthy audience Q&A. But I do want to remind our audience members, you can submit questions at any time during these presentations, whether for a panelist, for Elizabeth Anderson, or just to open it up to the entire group, and we'll return to those questions at the end of our conversation. So first, I would like to introduce Benjamin Waterhouse, who is Associate Professor of History and Associate Chair of his department at UNC Chapel Hill. Waterhouse earned his PhD from Harvard University, and his research focuses on American politics, political culture, and capitalism in the 20th century. And he is particularly interested in contests between economic groups, including business, labor, and the political class, and how the relationships among them shaped the broader contours of the American political tradition and American economic development. His 2014 book, Lobbying America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, explores the role that large national business associations and their lobbyists played in shaping economic policy and conservative politics between the 60s and the 90s. So Ben, thank you so much for being here with us. Next, we have Sarah Stroud, who is Professor of Philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill, where she also directs the Parr Center for Ethics. She received her doctorate from Harvard University and was previously Professor of Philosophy at McGill University, where she taught from 1993 until 2018. Sarah works across central areas of moral philosophy, with a particular focus on foundational issues in moral psychology and moral theory, and on the intersection of these issues with metaethics and the philosophy of action. In addition to publishing a number of academic papers, she co-edited Weakness of Will and Practical Irrationality in 2003 and the International Encyclopedia of Ethics in 2013. So Sarah, thank you for joining us today. Next, we have Deanne Spicer, who is a Maynard Adams Fellow for the Public Humanities and a PhD candidate in the Philosophy Department. She holds a BA in philosophy with a minor in English from the University of Maryland in Baltimore County, and her current research interests lie at the intersection of philosophy of language and social and political philosophy. She's particularly interested in indirect forms of communication, such as microaggressions, political dog whistles, and speech act theory. Spicer is also a 2021 recipient of a Tanner Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Welcome, Deanne. And last but not least, we are joined by Todd Ramon Ochoa, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at UNC. He earned his PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Columbia University and then held a postdoc at the University of California in Berkeley before joining the faculty of UNC Chapel Hill in 2008. Todd's research focuses on African-inspired societies and religions in Latin America and the Caribbean, Cuba, materiality and racialization, creolization, and hybridity, themes he explores in his 2010 book, Society of the Dead, Quitamanakita and Palo Praise in Cuba, as well as his 2020 book, A Party for Lazarus, Exuberance and Affliction in a Cuban Town. And Todd's teaching is oriented towards helping students to grasp social theory as a resource for scholarly creativity in the study of religion. So thank you, Todd, for being here. And at this point, I would invite Todd to get us started out with some themes and responses to Elizabeth's talk last night. And the rest of us can turn off our cameras here and hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you also to Lloyd and Max and Paul and everybody at Carolina Public Humanities for making this possible and for inviting me. Thank you to Jill Adams for your comments on your dad's work, especially what you said about the farm and growing tobacco. Dr. Elizabeth Anderson, thank you for your presentation last night, which I enjoyed for its relative liveliness and levity, given the grave dispiriting and even frightening on-the-ground realities that it seeks to address. I also appreciated the selection from your upcoming book, The Great Reversal, which you made available for panelists to read. I approached it with skepticism, but in the end, I was very persuaded. Persuaded as a 50-year-old middle class Mexican American who benefits from white privilege, who's politically progressive, politically active, and deeply concerned about income inequality, social mobility, not which, least of which is my own and that of my children, and also concerned with the rising US and global authoritarianism. So, I'm a sucker for what you've got to offer. The 50-year-old part is important because in a way that I wouldn't have been 30 or 20 or even 10 years ago, I'm ready to let go of zero-sum utopian absolutism in favor of the carefully constrained, historicized, geographically limited pragmatism of your critique and proposals. After the 20 years since September 11, 2001, the 12 years since the 2008 financial implosion and the brutally unequal economic recovery, and 4 years of Trump republicanism, I'm ripe for just the kind of political and economic pragmatism that you limit yourself to. As Joanna said, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I teach in religious studies. I research communities inspired by and descended from enslaved Africans in Cuba that have for centuries sought alternatives, outsides, and actual lived concrete escapes from the various work ethics imposed on them over the last 500 years, be that Spanish slave society, US capitalist neo-colonial administration, the first half of the 20th century, and since 1959, Soviet-style 21st century centralized state control. As Joanna said, my research is on African-inspired feasting, ancestor praise, spirit possession, healing and sorcery, including significant sacrificial activity, so robust sacrificial and gift economies. All of this happening in the undercommons of Cuban communist use value totalitarianism. So my professional and research biases lead me to favor a much larger social role for spiritual play, gift giving, unrecompensed use value surrenders like lavish sacrifices, and economically useless social effusiveness like feast activity. It leads me to favor the social role for these things, perhaps more than the progressive work ethic that you detail could possibly bear. So in this regard, I'm in line with your trio of work ethic skeptics, Weber, Keynes, and Graeber. In the spirit of political and economic pragmatism that you're offering, I want to lay that larger skepticism aside, except to say that if we're going to extend our critique and proposals, extend your critique, maybe our project, since I'm now bought in, if we're going to extend your critique and proposals to a hemispheric and even global scale, which you aspire to in the last paragraphs of the draft that you sent, in order to address climate crisis, we have to be ready to include models for human flourishing that exceed both of the Protestant-inspired work ethic regimes that you detail, the conservative and the progressive. When we take the progressive work ethic on the road, when we take it global, we're going to have to affirm folks who want to work just enough to feed their kids, praise their dead, and otherwise chill out. So I want to focus on two things specific to your project. Thinking about your presentation last night, I was hoping you would take a minute or two to talk to us about the commodification and decommodification of labor during the 200 to 300 years that are implied in the movement from theological to secular work ethics that you showed us in slide 10. In that slide, the way from theological to secular, on the way from theological to secularized work ethics, African slavery happens and the Industrial Revolution happens. And along the way, human beings are stripped of their most precious sense of self, which is our capacity to be freely creative, what Marx called alienation in the vocabulary of the economic and philosophical manuscripts. I would love for you to explain that commodification to us so that we can ponder, specifically so we can ponder the appropriateness of a spiritual vocabulary for either diagnosing the alienation millions of people are presently living under in neoliberal capitalism, or phrasing metrics for its amelioration. I'm thinking of you quoting Graeber on bullshit jobs inflicting spiritual violence on people. In the disenchanted secular world that Weber outlines for us in The Protestant Ethic, is this spiritual vocabulary the best for helping us to understand how creativity or creative capacity is sucked from us under neoliberal capitalism? I think that understanding commodification, including enslavement, and the decommodification efforts of social democratic reformers, including Marx, might help us either affirm this spiritual vocabulary or push us to seek more contemporary, secular, and disenchanted alternatives. The second topic I'd love for you to help us think through, I think predictably, is race. We've been contending with race and racial inequality here in Chapel Hill for decades, but acutely in the last 5 years. Our chancellor is presently in Alabama doing the work, as we say, and this community, our campus, faces some crucial crossroads in the months and years ahead. So helping us think this through would be wonderful. In the end, yours is a necessary study of whiteness, white people's religion, philosophy, epistemology, history, and metaphysical biases in Europe and in this continent. It's a damning historical portrait of selfish white millionaires, billionaires, and their intellectual enablers trashing the planet by using European Protestant theology and its secular cultural habits as formatting for their consciences. And so the question I have is, to what degree can the potential remedies of a progressive work ethic and communitarian social democratic reforms address the history of genocide, racial violence, and white supremacy, which made possible the very accumulation of wealth that grounded the success of American capitalist society in the 19th century? This is an economic success in which both the conservative and progressive work ethic were nourished and validated. So specifically, I want to test this out on the issue of reparations. Is the progressive work ethic, as you're proposing it here, capacious enough to encompass comprehensive reparations for slavery? If you could, give us a sense of how reparations might be phrased or staged to be consistent with the progressive work ethic you detail. Better yet, are there elements from the intellectual traditions of African American, indigenous, and borderlands intellectual perspectives in US history that could further particularize or creolize the progressive work ethic such that it's yet more pragmatically appropriate to a US, North American, or even Western hemispheric 21st century moment? Here I'm thinking about the civil rights movement, for example, and its spiritual resources and intensities, but I'm also thinking about indigenous ritual kinship and land stewardship practices, or an ethics of borderless Creole transformations. And this could perhaps begin to answer my question about the appropriateness of a spiritual vocabulary for either diagnosing or ameliorating the alienation of millions of people. I loved your presentation. I especially loved the chapter selections that you sent us, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to offer these, and I look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Todd, for those questions and for raising those themes of race, of commodification and decommodification of labor, and in particular for raising these questions around spiritual vocabulary and really around spiritual economies. How do spiritual economies that are often at apparent odds with a simply financially focused work ethic fit into this philosophy? So we'll return to those questions with Elizabeth Anderson here at the end of our conversation. But before we do so, I want to turn now to our philosophers and invite on Deanne to share her reflections with us.
Yeah, thank you. So like Carl, I want to thank the Adams family and donors and the Carolina Public Humanities for this fellowship that I got to be a part of this semester that I really enjoyed. And then I also want to thank Professor Anderson for her talk and the pieces of the manuscript that we got to read. As a private government, which I also read, I enjoyed learning about the history and the progression of ideologies surrounding labor and the relationships between workers and firms and the state. Perhaps fittingly following the panelists that I am following, my comments are aimed at inviting Professor Anderson to say more about the role of racial ideology in the success of conservative work ethic, and if there's any role that racial ideology will play in the shift to the progressive work ethic. So my thoughts come from the initial reading of some of the theological and then later secularized tenets of the conservative branch of the Puritan work ethic, and noticing how some of the tenets have not only a class stigma attached, but I would say also a racial stigma when it comes to what is bad or what is undesirable. Also, some terms such as entitled, lazy, welfare, and even government programs have become political dog whistles. And I wonder if the stigma and the effect of dog whistles are significant with regards to the persistence of the conservative work ethic and possible resistance to the progressive work ethic. So the tenets of the conservative work ethic that I'm interested in include the ideas that poor people are lazy, that poor people deserve to be poor, that not working is sinful or dishonorable, and that those who don't work shouldn't get charity. If you don't work, you don't eat, and that charity encourages vice and laziness. And so again, what I'm focusing on is whether the success of these ideas, as you say, the conservative work ethic is still prevalent in the US, whether the success of that is in part because of the racial ideology attached to these ideas. So I'll say a little more about what I mean by racial stigma and by racial dog whistles. So by racial stigma, I mean when a disgraceful circumstance or a disgraceful quality becomes conflated with certain race or races, so that the shame is no longer only affecting the people in those circumstances, but can affect all those who are perceived as a part of that racial category. For example, Michelle Alexander argues that criminal has become racially stigmatized, so that someone who's been convicted of a crime has a stigma, whether they're white or Black, but that criminality has become racially stigmatized so that it affects Black people who haven't been convicted of a crime. It just affects anyone now who's Black, as we can see possibly by the way that Black people are treated by the police or just by other citizens, or suggestions that banning the box on employment applications where you check whether or not you've been convicted of a crime. There's some people who say that if you actually take that box off of applications, it will encourage more discrimination, because then employers will just assume that Black and brown people have been convicted of crimes. And so this racial stigma of criminality just affects all Black and brown people regardless of their history. And so I'm wondering if there's a racial stigma also attached to these ideas of the conservative work ethic, at least the bad ones. So I just want to point out that racial stigma doesn't necessarily become attached to concepts because of facts on the ground. So, you know, there's something like the welfare queen of the 1980s, who successfully made it so that Black Americans are primarily associated with welfare, even though most people who benefit from government assistance are white, as you would expect in a country that's 76% white. If you include things like the billions of dollars that went towards farmers because of Trump's trade war, or as coronavirus relief, 94 to 99% of those farmers whom were white, if you consider that social welfare, then that number even increases. However, the racial stigma of something like welfare is so strong that welfare recipient almost becomes conflated with Black. Similarly, things like illegal work, which might be considered dishonorable work based on the work ethic, whether that means illegal markets, like working in illegal markets such as drug dealing or sex work, or working legitimate markets but illegally, also has a racial stigma. So that just is what I mean by racial stigma. And so now to dog whistles. So if a term is a covert dog whistle, according to Jennifer Saul, as she defines them, it brings an audience's prior racial attitudes to bear on how they make decisions, how they answer questions, how they evaluate statements, and even how they evaluate like political candidates. So if a term like government programs is a racial dog whistle, which Saul has argued it is based on evidence, then using it will cause someone's racial resentment or racist attitudes to negatively affect how they evaluate statements such as increasing government spending would benefit everyone. The dog whistle of government spending or government programs cues someone's already racist attitudes so that they would negatively evaluate that statement and think government spending means giving undeserving Black people money, and then they would say, no, increasing government programs does not benefit everyone. So that's what I mean by dog whistles. So relating it back to work ethic, I think the conservative and the progressive work ethics both have terms or concepts that might have racial stigmas attached to them or that are racial dog whistles. For example, the lazy poor people who don't deserve handouts. You know, handout might be a dog whistle, or the lazy poor people might have a racial stigma attached to it. Also, with the progressive work ethic, social insurance, or like I said, government programs might be a racial dog whistle, so that people actually evaluate those terms negatively based on their prior racist attitudes. So even if racial stigma isn't supported by the actual state of affairs, I think it can do at least two things combined with the effects of dog whistles. So the first thing is the narrative or the ideology created by this racial stigma and the dog whistles might be strong enough that many white Americans buy into it and take comfort in it. So they can still strive to attain the just deserts of their hard work within the conservative work ethic story without having to support the undeserving. They can tell themselves that the story that the lazy, poor people who aren't like them will get what they deserve and that their hard work will eventually pay off. And then they can keep faith in a system that they can believe will reward their hard work and continue to blame others for their misfortunes and base some of this blame at least on racial factors, but whether that's essentialism or like pathological factors that they believe in. So that's the first thing, is that the racial stigma, the dog whistles, can help white Americans to buy into the conservative work ethic and take comfort in it. The second thing that I think it can do is, I think that the stigma associated with the things the progressive work ethic would endorse, such as the right to charity and social programs, might make it so that many white Americans would reject these things as desirable or good. Just one example, in 2019, the Washington Post reported that more than a quarter of people living in poverty actually don't receive benefits from the government, and that most of those who don't receive benefits are white. Now, there may be many reasons why this is, including the overall net worth of people with the same income. White people tend to have overall greater net worth, even if they have the same income as Black families, and that maybe white people have greater safety nets, even if they have the same income in terms of having poverty wages. But researchers suspect that at least some of it has to do with the racial stigma of being on welfare, of getting government assistance. And so that some of the progressive work ethic endorsements would be rejected as bad just because of the racial stigma attached to them. So I'm interested in any thoughts that Professor Anderson has on whether this sounds correct, anything that I'm saying, that this sort of racial stigma would support the continued acceptance of the conservative work ethic, and if it does, whether the progressive work ethic can successfully take its place without first dealing with the underlying racial and racist ideology. I'm interested to hear if Professor Anderson has any responses and what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deanne, for drawing our attention to the role that racial stigma and dog whistles can play, both in how work ethics have developed historically and how they are embraced today. And it's interesting to me that, like Todd, you're drawing our attention to issues of vocabulary, showing how our language around labor can actually be a way to talk about race, and indeed to veil racist ideologies, even as they remain very much at the center of our public discourse. So this is a theme we'll certainly return to in our conversation here in a moment. But first, let's hear from our second philosopher on the panel, Sarah Stroud.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Carolina Public Humanities, for inviting me. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to engage with the work of Elizabeth Anderson, who I'd also like to thank for such a thought-provoking and rich presentation and manuscript portions that we were sent. I guess I really want to ask a kind of extended question of Professor Anderson, more than giving remarks of my own. I'll just preface this by saying that one reason I found your talk and manuscript so fascinating and thought-provoking was that I guess I'd always viewed the work ethic, or the Protestant work ethic as it's called, something that maybe I was cursed with, but not anything to celebrate or to find positive or worth tending and reformulating. So I was particularly fascinated by your attempts to bring out more positive elements to the work ethic tradition that would serve us well going into the future. And what I want to ask you about today is one of those positive elements. So one theme in your remark and manuscript that I want to pick up on is the idea of the dignity of work and of workers. This struck me as a really fecund idea or concept that felt very attractive to me, but as so often with things that strike one as a sort of deep and important truth, I don't quite know what it means. So my extended question is just to get a discussion going on what concretely would dignity for work or workers look like. In what ways precisely do our current arrangements somehow deny dignity to work or workers? And how would we know that dignity had been restored to them if we met it? So starting with some strands that I think I found in your work, I wanted to sort of try to weave them together into at least a partial portrait of what dignity might consist in for work or workers. And I guess I'm struck that there seem to be a lot of different elements to this that would have to come into confluence in order to get the kind of rich package of statuses and regard that we might want to identify with dignity. So one thing that it seems clear is relevant to whether we would want to say that dignity is accorded to work and workers is different kinds of economic arrangements between employers and employees. So here, while you didn't comment on it yesterday, one thing that comes to my mind as probably a key element is the contemporary precariat in the workforce, the fact that we now live in a gig economy where those of us who are from an older generation think in terms of careers that in a way that seems not even applicable now. So I am guessing that being employed as a gig worker is something that you would consider relevant to whether workers are accorded dignity. And so that maybe one way to improve dignity for work and workers would be if we could move away from the kind of precarious employment that characterizes the gig economy. So that's one sort of sub-question. Is I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about the gig economy and the contemporary precariat. So economic arrangements, definitely relevant to dignity. A second thing that I would imagine is relevant to dignity is something that you talked about quite a lot in your manuscript, which is the way in which social programs provided by government place workers in a more secure position. So if we all have a social safety net, if we all have health insurance, if we all have government mandated pensions, I am guessing that you would consider those kinds of measures to contribute to the dignity of workers. I suppose one might quarrel with that to say that, yes, those contribute to dignity, but not to the dignity of workers per se. They contribute to the dignity of every citizen, so that we should file those under, as it were, a different heading, even if we recognize that they contribute to dignity. So I think it's interesting in any case that things from outside the world of work per se, like the provision of social programs by the government, are, I take it, an important contributor to dignity. A third thing that I imagine you would say is a contributor to dignity is something that you stressed yesterday, which is a voice in workplace governance. So here we return to the world of work to comment not so much on the economic arrangements that I mentioned first of all, but rather the internal government of the workplace and the way in which if workers are actually given a role in making decisions and governing their own workplace, I take it you would say that that gives them more dignity. What I wanted to end with is the idea that even though there might be all these different dimensions to what would contribute to worker dignity, at least the three that I've mentioned, I'm wondering whether even if we had improvements on all the three dimensions that I've already identified, and I'm not holding my breath waiting for that to happen, but I'm wondering if even if we had improvement on all those fronts, there's a fourth key element that would also have to change before workers would really have dignity, and that's social attitudes. So my proposal that I want to put to you, I'd like to hear what you say about this, is that I imagine that a potent contributor to the lack of dignity of at least some workers in contemporary society is that we don't hold them or their work in very high regard, where this is more a matter of informal and personal, even if socially prevalent, attitudes than it is about anything institutional, any government arrangements, workplace arrangements, etc. That until we actually come to value and valorize essential work, public-facing work, menial work that nonetheless makes everyone's lives better, just try not having the toilets cleaned for a while and you'll appreciate that somebody's doing that. My suspicion is that until social attitudes change, at least some workers won't have dignity. And here I want to end, if you think this speculation is right, with the suggestion that capitalism itself might limit the degree to which social attitudes are ever going to strongly valorize the kind of essential but poorly remunerated work that a lot of people in our society are doing. Capitalism, one might say, encourages us to look at possession of wealth as a measure of merit. It encourages us to measure ourselves against the Joneses. And so this might be a place where this discussion meets up in a productive way with your own hugely important work on egalitarianism, understood as a kind of equality in social standing and social relationships. So the final bit of my question is, if you think it's right that social attitudes are a key part of worker dignity, what are the prospects for improving those in the kind of society in which we live? Thank you so much, Professor Anderson.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for raising all of these really pragmatic questions and hypotheses about what goes into shaping the dignity that is felt or emphatically not felt by workers. Issues of social attitude, of government support, of precarity. And I want to point here to how many unanswered questions we had last night, specifically about that theme and about the gig economy and where we're going with that. So certainly I think we should spend some more time revisiting these questions. But last but not least, we will turn now to Ben Waterhouse to get a historian's perspective on these ideas.
Well, great. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to respond to this thought-provoking talk we heard yesterday. I've been asked specifically to comment kind of from the perspective not only of history, but of business and economic history, which is my area of study. So I note, in the talk we heard yesterday, as it was engaging and wide-ranging and covered a lot of historical ground, ranging from 17th century Puritans to 18th century political economists to Max Weber writing really amidst the Industrial Revolution in 1905, and then to David Graeber sort of responding to the post-industrial neoliberal economy in the 2010s. And in this account, ideas do a lot of work across the argument, perhaps taking attention away from some of the underlying questions related to the organization of the economy and how it changed, specifically, the history of capitalism itself. So building in some ways, I think, on Todd's comments, I'd like to frame some questions for Professor Anderson about a few major trends in business and economics and sort of steer our conversation that way a bit in an effort to provide Professor Anderson a chance to kind of link the ideational and the material, or the base and superstructure, as it were. So in the question and answer period yesterday, we explored in some detail, more so than the original talk, the contributions to debates about the work ethic that emerged from the writing of Karl Marx, including particularly the challenge of how to counteract the alienation and commodification of labor, which are also points that Todd raised at the beginning. And of course, that way of thinking about work in Marx was itself historically situated, and it stemmed from the very new way of organizing labor through the industrial factory system that took off in the 19th century. And of course, as we know, that change really was world historical. It changed the whole game about what work was and how labor existed in a way that is really, I think, vital to see the evolution of these ideas. Clearly, Smith and Locke, let alone the Puritans, were not contemplating systems where thousands of people performed the same tasks at large integrated industrial firms. Indeed, for all of world history, before the latter decades of the 19th century, the only time thousands of human beings ever showed up all at the same place at the same time to do the same thing, they were trying to kill each other. And yet modern life and the modern corporation and industrial capitalism fundamentally changed that. And the industrialization of the second half of the 19th century also changed our social expectations of the kind of big picture of what work could create. And specifically, it led to a massive increase in economic growth itself. But just as economic growth grew as a result of the industrialization in the 19th century, it also stopped growing about 100 years later. So this is the sort of first trend I'd like to kind of raise and see how this figures into our discussion of the work ethic. So the economist Robert Gordon, for example, among others, has argued, I think, quite persuasively that the period from the 1870s to the 1970s was really very unique in human history, that the technologies that emerged in the late 19th century and then really kind of took off and started getting going in the early part of the 20th century created a series of changes, boosts in worker productivity and in human health and lifespan and in efficiency that were so monumental, so fundamental that they could never be recaptured. And if, to summarize him just a little bit bluntly, you can basically only create indoor plumbing once. And the reason I think that matters is that it's a critical part of the story, I think, that that Professor Anderson introduced yesterday, which is what has changed since the 1970s. And the contours of this are, I think, broadly known, and we talk about it quite a lot, even though we don't necessarily always put it into a historical framework. In the last 50 years, the returns to capital have far outstripped the returns to labor. And income inequality has been a direct consequence. The business world is increasingly financialized and monopolized. And frankly, the smart money these days is on rentier capitalism. And that includes the vulture capitalists, Professor Anderson, that you mentioned yesterday, and frankly, most of the financial services industry, which I think is important to remember was the big industry that Graeber singled out as kind of the quintessence of the bullshit job. But the development of this state of affairs, of a financialized economy, of rentier capitalism, of the greater returns to capital as opposed to labor, was not just a series of choices that people made kind of rationally and on their own. In fact, it was deeply shaped by the end of the growth economy and the subversion of the expectations that had become ingrained during the middle decades of the 20th century, particularly among voters in democratic societies. And so I wonder if Professor Anderson might comment on how long-term stagnation and the sort of sharp declines in productivity gains and the failure to revive any of this influences our options as we rethink the nature of work and the work ethic going forward. So that's sort of the first big long-term trend. The second trend is related, and that is the atomization of the corporation since the 1980s. Professor Anderson's colleague at Michigan in the business school, Jerry Davis, has pointed out that in the last several decades, big business weirdly has gotten smaller. Since the bust up of the conglomerates in the 1970s and 1980s, corporations at the large end have actually mostly begun employing fewer people. Not true across the board, but in the main, the largest corporations employ fewer people now than they did in the 1950s or 60s. And increasingly big companies outsource many, many more functions, both overseas and domestically, to smaller companies, creating what David Weil calls the fissured workplace. And this, of course, is somewhat paradoxical and sometimes strikes our ears strangely, because we're accustomed to thinking about big business becoming larger and more monopolistic and more rent-seeking, which is true, except when it comes to their role as sites of work, where corporations, large institutions, are in fact becoming less of the site of work than they were during the sort of golden age of mid-century, 20th century capitalism. And I think we can see manifestations of this phenomenon in a number of different places. Culturally, we see this sort of acceptance of the decreasing place of corporations as work sites in, for example, our sort of group fawning over startup culture, over self-employment and being your own boss, more broadly over the sort of appeal of small business as a cultural touchstone. And frankly, as Sarah brought up just a few minutes ago, we see this dynamic at play in the increased attention to the gig economy. So I wonder if you could weigh in on these trends and, basically, where do you see the workplace going? And in particular, if the trend is toward more atomized or decentered work, that's the exact opposite of the conditions that allowed the labor movement to develop and flourish during the industrial economy in the 19th and 20th centuries, raising questions for, I think, the possibilities of co-determination or union power more broadly. And so having laid out a couple of historical notes, I will stop there and look forward to this engaging panel discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben, for those thoughts and for drawing our attention towards these kind of broad trends: long-term stagnation, declines in productivity gains, the atomization of big business. These are all hugely important for us to think about as we evaluate, what the potentialities are for worker experiences moving forward and for this transformed work ethic. Well, at this point, I would invite all four of our panelists back on, along with Dr. Elizabeth Anderson. And Elizabeth, I know we just threw a lot of questions and themes at you, but if you would like to share some initial responses, that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much for these wonderful comments. They're incredibly rich. So I'll take them in order. I'm not sure what to say about the kinds of concerns that Todd raises, because, in my focus of research really has been on Protestant traditions. So I'm not that familiar with other modes of spiritual thinking, but I will say that one thing that I've learned, so, personally, I'm an atheist. However, one thing that I've learned from 19th century philosophers who themselves were atheists is that they had a very different approach to encountering religious believers and religious traditions than what we see among the new atheists today. So if you look at new atheists like Richard Dawkins, they're obsessed with the ontological question, does God exist? And if you look at 19th century people from Hegel on, the question of existence wasn't really fundamental, because there was this whole tradition. You have Hegel, you have Feuerbach, you have Marx, and Mill actually is in this tradition. He was an avowed atheist. And basically, all of them thought that spiritual discourse and talk about God was a projection of human aspirations onto another world. And so it's a different way. That's a different way of talking about aspirations and ideals. And the point of that objectification of ideals in the image of spirits and so forth was to represent to ourselves that there is a kind of truth there that maybe lays a claim on us. And it's not just sort of whatever we feel like. And so that objectification, if you look in the Hegelian tradition, is incredibly useful, because then we can kind of sense its demands. Now, ultimately, all of these theorists thought that we should come to self-consciousness of the fact that this is actually projection, and then we can take control over the development of our own ideals. But they didn't dismiss at all religious modes of talking, because they saw that as a sort of necessary step of objectifying ideals to something outside before we can start working with it productively, and see it as making claims on us and not just whatever goes, right? And I found that very useful, and so I'm perfectly happy to talk. It's like some of my most productive discussions about the work ethic has been with Protestant ministers, all of whom in seminary read Baxter. So that they know where this is coming from, and they appreciate some of his ideas. Now, about reparations and the history of slavery, this is absolutely central. And Todd raises this, and so does Deanne. And indeed, in my book, there's a lot more to my book than I could share with you because it's a very long manuscript. But Deanne and Todd are really homing in on a really deep truth about the conservative work ethic, which Americans still live with and still profoundly affects the structure of racism. Okay, and so I want to give you a little bit of that history because it's so profound and it really illuminates our contemporary condition. So Deanne is absolutely correct that if you look at the content of anti-Black stigmatization, it essentially amounts to the charge that Blacks are not living up to the work ethic, right? If you look at the list of virtues of the work ethic, you got to be a hard worker, industrious, conscientious. Chastity is important, no lust, right? Here we're looking at the virtues of the conservative work ethic. Being independent is self-sufficient, frugality, saving. So there's a presumption that, like, if you can't make ends meet, it probably means that you have been spending unwisely. Right, and those, of course, together, as well as a disposition to sort of try to get money, either, basically by leeching off other people. And whether that's through welfare or, say, through theft or various criminal activity, right? All of these stereotypes are built into anti-Black racism in the United States, but the content then of anti-Black racism in the United States is coming straight out of the conservative work ethic and the charge that Blacks are not living up to the demands of the work ethic. Now, as it happens, this goes back, this ideology actually goes back, and I trace this history to a very important political economist that nobody reads anymore, Richard Whately, who was the Archbishop of the Church of England in Ireland. And he actually wrote some lectures in political economy, which were designed to popularize the conservative work ethic and the style of political economy that was coming from Malthus. And basically what he argued, and here was the great puzzle, okay? If you look at the Puritans, the very first model of a sinner was the useless, lazy landlords who were doing nothing but collecting the rents. And these Puritans had a way of describing the lazy landlords, the aristocrats, okay? And they said that they were like drones in the nest, right? What are they doing? It's like those drones, they're not like the worker bees. The worker bees are virtuous because they're making all the honey that's brought into the nest, right? No, but the drones, what are they? They're not doing any work at all. All that they're doing is having sex with the queen. Right? Get rid of them. They're useless, right? And you see that metaphor of drones in the nest constantly. You can even find it in Mill's Principles of Political Economy. But this raised a problem because the penetration of the work ethic was so deep in England. The landowners were clearly threatened by it. And in the 19th century, the landowners, and remember, England, there were about 30,000 landowners who owned essentially all the land in England. Okay, it's like a tiny, tiny number of people. At the turn of the century, there were maybe 11 or 12 million people in England, and maybe plus Scotland, which wasn't that big in those days, and Wales, again, very small. And 30,000 owned practically everything. And even to this day, land ownership is very concentrated in the UK. 40,000 landowners own half the land in the UK. Think about that. We have a country, maybe 65 million, and 40,000 own half the land. Okay, so that is continued. And Whately basically is trying to figure out how to reconfigure the work ethic from the landowner's point of view, right? How do you justify the drones in the nest, basically? And his lectures on political economy tied this in to this kind of racist reactionary theory of the progress of civilization, okay? And his idea was that it really is like the core ideology of racist imperialism that Europe practiced, that, you know, those savage people, those barbarians, right, can't civilize themselves. They need already civilized people to civilize them. And civilization requires a bunch of, you know, worker bees, basically, who are consigned to precarity so that they can basically support a leisure class, which is the source of all civilization, like the arts and the sciences and things like that. And that was sort of the essential imperialist ideology that, of course, is deeply racist. It was designed to justify European imperialism entirely on a racist basis. But here's the thing, is that Whately also applied that same ideology domestically. So even within the so-called civilized countries, he argued you had savages and barbarians, which were these lower class workers. And remember, Whately, as Bishop of the Church of England in Ireland, his target was the Irish peasants, okay? And, you know, he was just as racist to them. And, you know, it makes sense once you consider that Ireland basically was a colony, right? I mean, it was subject to conquest. It was England's first colony for all practical purposes. And in my book, I deal with the Irish famine and how this reactionary imperialist ideology was used to attack the Irish peasantry. And during the famine, relief funds were purposely withheld precisely to clear the landed estates of Irish peasants and convert Irish agriculture on the capitalist basis that it already had in England, where you would have landless agricultural laborers working for a wage to grow all the crops, which was the English model. And in fact, John Stuart Mill, in his Principles of Political Economy, argued strongly against this with Ireland in mind and the tragedy of the famine, which killed 1 million people and also forced another 1.5 million Irish to move to North America, mostly the United States. And he said, no, we should celebrate the peasants. And he argued that the land should be taken from the Irish landlords and divided up among the Irish peasants so they could become self-sufficient landowners, right? It was a model of self-employment as a kind of model of worker liberation. And that was Mill's model for agriculture in Ireland. The English, you couldn't do that because it was too far gone. And then his model of workers, of factory workers, was they should all be in worker cooperatives. So, but I do want to strongly endorse then Deanne's view that the conservative work ethic lies at the heart of racist ideology, and we could see that in the history too, not just within the United States, but in fact, you know, in global imperialism. This is really all where it came from. So here's the question, though, that Deanne raises, which has to do with whether the progressive work ethic is equally subject, or at least partially subject, to this criticism because of, you know, government programs. Well, in my book, I have a section on the origins of social insurance. And the great hero of this section is Tom Paine, who was a radical, who was the hero of English radical workers who were fighting for constitutional reforms that would enfranchise them. but he, of course, he's also a big American revolutionary. And he was also briefly a French revolutionary. And almost lost his head. He's a very interesting story. He was a very active pamphleteer and agitator in all three countries. But he was the basic inventor of social insurance. And he was the first person to actually demonstrate using English tax revenues, a calculation of what England could raise as tax revenues, to show that you could abolish poverty through a social insurance program combined with universal stakeholder grants for young adults just starting out in life. You just give them a pot of money up front, all based on estate taxes. And, he runs the calculations, and, you just have estate taxes and you could fund all of this. And more recently in America, they did this about, who was it? Bruce Ackerman made the calculation on estate taxes could give every 21-year-old, they reach 21 and they could get $80,000 right off. Imagine what we could do with that. Every universal, right? That would solve a lot of problems, wouldn't it? And the thing is that these kinds of ideas are wildly popular. So Social Security, Medicare have incredible popularity among Democrats and Republicans alike. They've polled Tea Partiers and they love their Medicare. Now, the thing is that they don't call it government. They don't call it a government program, okay? Because it's been framed as a reward for their work. Okay, but we know, in fact, that, it's funded through general tax revenues and everything's fungible. So there's kind of an illusion here and a framing effect that's been going on that was deliberate choice of Franklin Roosevelt in order to secure social insurance from conservative cutbacks. If you convince everybody they've earned it, they're going to fight like hell to retain it. But Paine's insight was, if you make the benefits universal and basically and frame it as a property rights argument, then people don't have any problems getting unearned income from property. They don't want handouts, but if you get it as a capital return, it's okay. And so Paine's argument for social insurance was just pure Lockeanism. Right. So Locke thought in the state of nature, you could enclose the commons without asking anybody's permission by working the land. Right. And that gives you property entitlement to that land. And Paine said, but look, you're only entitled, to the value added by your labor to the land. But what about the underlying natural value of the land or its social value? The fact that it has a higher market price would yield higher rents when it's closer to like cities and markets and so forth. He says, well, nobody deserves that. It's not their own labor that is the cause of the high rents. And you see Ricardo picking up that argument. Then that's just something to know that, it's owed to the rest of society, right? Because we all originally held the earth in common. So we should all get it equal. It should just be all divvied up equally. Right. And as soon as you can frame it as a property claim, then there's no stigma attached to it. And that's the source, for instance, of why Alaska's universal royalty system, where you divide the royalties of the oil in Alaska equally among all Alaskans, right? It's wildly popular. Nobody thinks there's anything stigmatizing about it. Okay. Moving on to Sarah's wonderful comments, I agree entirely with these four claims. And I do also agree that social attitudes are the hardest part. And let me just tell you a story to illustrate the difference in attitudes. There's this really great cartoon, and I wish I had retained a copy, but it's illustrating the difference between a dog's perspective and a cat's perspective, okay? So the cat is looking upon its owner, right? And it says, he feeds me, he takes care of me, he takes me to the vet, he combs my hair, my fur. I must be a god. And the dog is looking at the owner and says, he feeds me and he takes me to the vet and, he combs my fur and all this. He must be a god. Right? And so in a way, the dog, the work ethic, the progressive work ethic is in a way telling us to take the dog's perspective rather than the cat's perspective, right? Right? The cat is like the lazy landlord. I'm the god, so I should be served, right? And the dog is saying, no, it's like the beings who are working hard and providing all these goods, they're the ones who really should, worship is of course extreme, but the thought is that, look, it's the people who are actually like providing for the needs of human beings who are entitled to respect and esteem, not just for just owning stuff. Like, that's completely ridiculous, right? Right? It's the people who are actually promoting the welfare of humanity that are entitled to esteem, and not just people who are, right? The lazy people are the people who are just living off property income, right? And so we do, what we see today with this competitive consumption and keeping up with the Joneses and so forth. Right, that's the conservative work ethic. And I trace it back in my book to Joseph Priestley. And Mill was exactly the opposite. So the question is whether the point of life is just to compete with each other over conspicuous consumption and save hard so that you could then buy a lot of luxuries and show them off of how great you are. You've got all these luxuries. And by the way, that also has a racist story in the United States that was primarily directed against Asian Americans coming over. Chinese coming over were working for lower wages in the 19th century. And, they were undercutting the labor movement, but they argued they don't have any dignity because they're not demanding enough money to actually consume, right? And they were highlighting the sort of reactionary racist aspects of the labor movement, was highlighting this competitive consumption idea. Like you should withhold your labor until the wages are high enough that you could actually be a consumer. Right, and that was a sort of reactionary dimension to the labor movement that had a racist implication, because the Chinese who were brought over are contract workers who didn't really have it, right. They were even more disempowered than white workers, at the time. So, and getting back to reparations, actually, because that was also a point that was raised. There's every reason to think, look, in a way you could see Paine's argument, it's kind of a reparations argument, because the landowners took all this stuff without ever having compensated humanity for the natural value of the Earth's products, right? Although his point is that reparations, in a way, have to be structural. It's not just a one-off payment for all the stuff stolen in the past. You have to permanently reorganize society so that all workers can have decent lives, right? And so that's really critical. And let's see here. So the question is that Sarah raised was about capitalism itself. Is it ever compatible with valorizing menial work? What are the prospects for workers given capitalism? My argument for this is it all depends on what you mean by capitalism, and there's varieties of capitalism. So if by capitalism you mean a system in which, say, maximizing profits is a central goal, well, that is shareholder capitalism that we know it today. And I argue in the stuff that I gave you that that's really perverse, and it's just sort of the modern version of the conservative work ethic. But there's a lot of different ways to regulate capitalism. And, social democracy was the best we ever got in Europe. It never really, we had very weak versions of stuff that was configured much more successfully in Europe for a long time. We could talk about the decline of social democracy in Europe, which is a complicated subject, but I'm happy to get into that if you want. And so this brings me then to Ben's wonderful comments about the necessity of tying the ideas to the underlying economic developments. And I do that a lot more in my book. The main point I'd like to push back against Ben is the idea that the end of the growth economy is due to the idea that it's sort of like a one shot. Now, there is a genuine question about how much we need further economic growth. Okay, and again, Mill here is incredibly interesting on this point. So Mill's predecessor in the sort of pantheon of classical economists was David Ricardo. Okay, and Ricardo had this theory of the stationary state. So he had a model of the capitalist economy according to which growth would basically peter out and you would get a stationary state. And in the stationary state, according to his model, because of perfect competition among capitalists, profits would get driven to zero. And you still learn this in Econ 101, right? If you have perfect competition, ultimately profits get run to zero. And he also accepted Malthus's theory of population. And so he thought that if you have an increase in wages, workers would just reproduce, they'd have larger families. And so wages would be driven to subsistence. And so all the surplus of society, he argued, would go to the landlords as rent. So you have this kind of catastrophe for the work ethic, you know, in Ricardo's model, because then it's like the workers who are the industrious people and the capitalists who are the frugal people, right? They get cut out and the lazy landlords get everything and they're neither industrious nor frugal, right? So you have a kind of disaster. And Ricardo himself in his Principles of Political Economy said, you know, rent is just a transfer from one class to another. It has no economic function. It's just the landlords want it. And so they take it and, you know, the rules of the market system kind of like hand it over to them. So, you know, he thought the landlords were pretty useless too. But Mill, looking at the stationary state, saw a different promise in the end of economic growth. And that was, once economic growth, suppose we all get prosperous, like you need a state in which everybody can have a decent standard of living. Okay. And I think that's clearly, you know, economically possible, although we got to worry about climate change, right? And what it takes, and we had to radically reconfigure how we produce stuff in order to make the achievement of a decent standard of living for everyone compatible with a sustainable earth. Okay, that's absolutely critical and central. I think that's possible. That is that the poor need not always be with us. But what Mill saw as the promise in the stationary state was that then it makes this endless, you know, the conservative work ethic was all about endless competitive consumption and a race for luxury. Right. And if economic growth ends, then that just becomes pointless. Right. There's nothing more to chase after. Right. Because there's no more economic growth. And so he thought this will get us off this preposterous conservative work ethic, which has a hollow kind of picture of human relationships as essentially antagonistic, because all we're engaged in this zero-sum esteem competition where I can raise myself in the eyes of others only by pushing other people down. And he thought, no, we'll be liberated. We'll get off that perverse conception. And in the stationary state, be able to cultivate relations of equality and sympathy with each other, and just toss away this old conservative work ethic. That was his hope. But you can even see elements of the stationary state in Rawls, right? So he's picking up on that in A Theory of Justice. It's kind of interesting to see that. So I don't think we need endless growth. What we do need is the end of rentier capitalism. You know, and that's a function of institutions, of institutional design. So I see the shift to ever increasing inequality as a product of a whole bunch of explicitly political decisions about deregulation that took place from the 70s on. Okay, and we could regulate things differently so that you don't put all the cards in the hands of the financiers and so forth, right? It was a deliberate decision not to regulate derivatives, for instance. It was a deliberate decision not to enforce antitrust. It was a deliberate decision to massively increase the duration of copyright, which is just another form of monopoly, right? And we just like dozens and dozens of decisions like this. Some of them made in the courts, some of them legislatively, some by regulatory bodies. So there's a lot of different actors here. And then, of course, the way capitalism entered its, next wave of globalization wrote out the interests of workers who were excluded, because it was basically just deals cut by capitalists about how you regulate global trade. But there's no reason why you can't reconfigure the rules of global trade to have a system that ratchets up global labor standards so that, people aren't, rich people or people in the rich countries aren't consuming all the cheap stuff because, you have millions of workers in sweatshops and even laboring under slave conditions around the world. And in fact, only trivial changes in the prices faced by rich world consumers can make a spectacular difference. So like the price of a shirt, to double the wages of, say, a Salvadorian worker who is sewing shirts, men's shirts, the cost of that to the consumer is like 25 cents a shirt. Like you wouldn't even notice it. And you can massively increase the incomes of the people who are doing all the work in poor countries. And you wouldn't even notice it. Same like coffee. Like coffee farmers are getting essentially nothing, and Starbucks or whatever is getting all the profits. There's no reason for that. I mean, you could just like compensate the farmers who are growing this stuff and decently. And by the way, that would also have an interesting side effect of reducing migration from Central America, because a lot of it is the coffee farmers are in desperation in Central America. A lot of them are, they're moving north. But there are ways to rescue that, but you have to basically force the profits from the coffee shop companies, right, to be invested back in those countries where they're sourcing the coffee. This is not hard. You can do it by regulation, but it's got to be done. Anyway, I'm gonna stop there and open up for Q&A.
Thank you so much for those thorough answers to some of the questions that got raised and for providing some additional historical context to that. We do have a lot of audience questions to tackle, but before we do so, I want to offer to our other panelists the chance to respond to any of the themes that Elizabeth just raised. All right. Well, I do encourage you all to feel free to jump in here and ask one another questions and to speak up on any theme that feels relevant to you. So, one of the questions that came in feels very connected to what Elizabeth was just addressing, which is the power of consumers in shifting work cultures and in shifting what certain industries look like. And so Michael Prinzing, one of our Adams Fellows, raises a question about the voluntary simplicity movement. And he says, empirical research on this voluntary simplicity movement has suggested that voluntary simplifiers, folks who simply commit to buying less, do in fact consume less and emit less, therefore contributing less to climate change, and are happier than the average American. Do you think we should promote this kind of thing? And how are these kind of consumer habits connected to a progressive work ethic?
Yeah, so I think we definitely have to rethink consumption, But if we do that, we also have to consider the workers whose livelihoods depend on, I mean, it's just like part of the globalized capitalist system. If we all stopped drinking coffee, you'd have millions of starving people among the coffee growers. Okay, what's going to happen to them? So I do think we have to think very carefully. It's absolutely right that the culture of conspicuous consumption and the race for luxury is a process that's highly destructive of the earth. But figuring out an off-ramp for everyone is a global challenge, and it's not something that we can do just as individuals. So we have to think carefully about how to reconfigure institutions so that lots of people are not left behind. And it's absolutely core to everyone in the progressive work ethic tradition. So I have other stuff in my book about the origins of utilitarianism, and basically it was invented by these Puritan preachers of the work ethic. They invented utilitarianism. It's right there in their texts. But there's a contest, okay, in how we interpret utilitarianism, okay? And, you have sort of classical utilitarianism, Bentham style, where you just maximize happiness. You just maximize the aggregate, okay? And the classic objection to that is, well, that could justify running roughshod over, a whole bunch of people just in order to maximize the total. Don't we need room for human rights here? That's a classic objection. But in fact, if you go back to the original utilitarians, these Puritans, they had, a finely articulated understanding of society as a system of cooperation, just like every gear in the clock mechanism. And hence they insisted that each particular individual needed to be taken care of for society to work. You can't just run roughshod over these tiny little gears, like the whole system gets mucked up. We have duties absolutely to everyone. And it never crossed their minds that you just sort of maximize an aggregate and you can toss out, some people or set them aside in the name of some just swelling an aggregate. And you see that thought carried through Locke and John Stuart Mill and his very important alterations from Benthamite utilitarianism. That ultimately, when we cultivate a sense of full sympathy for our fellow human beings, we will never seek a good for ourselves, right? That leaves others behind, right? Everyone has to be included in the benefits of society, and he was quite clear about that. But that was actually the original Puritan vision of utilitarianism. And this one where you just sort of swell an aggregate, that was used to justify like wiping out the Irish peasants, and who cares if 1 million die and 1.5 million are driven from the land and have to emigrate somewhere else, right? I mean, that's really at the core of the conservative work ethic. And Bentham himself, even though he has some, he hated the lazy landlords, but the truth is that he was absolutely contemptuous of the poor. And his panopticon prison design, he also elaborated into this sort of lunatic vision of outsourcing welfare provision to private for-profit providers who would set up all these panopticon prisons and be authorized to kidnap vagrants and homeless people and other impoverished people from the streets and stick them in these panopticons and subject them to forced labor. So, the ideology of slavery, that it wasn't just chattel slavery, but it was extended to the poor, to England's poor, in this sort of very harsh conservative ideology. And again, because, they don't know the work ethic, so they got to be forced, and, the bourgeoisie will teach them through slavery how to work hard.
So a quick follow-up question related to that. We started out there with a question about the responsibility of consumers in changing the work ethic. Here we have a related question from an audience member about the responsibility of CEOs, who, brings us back to the numbers about wild inflation of CEO salaries that you shared with us yesterday, and shares the story of a CEO of Gravity Payments Incorporated, a Seattle company, where the CEO in 2015 was drawing a $1.1 million salary, knocked that down to a $70,000 salary in order to pay his 130 employees the same salary as himself. And he was labeled a socialist by conservative news outlets, but the company has apparently been doing quite well since then. So this audience member asks for your thoughts on whether this is a model that could be replicated, or what the limits are of this model.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the company is still doing well, because I heard that it was part owned by his brother, and his brother filed a lawsuit that this executive shouldn't be giving such high salaries. I can't remember what happened to it, but I do want to point out that I do think that changing the economy of esteem for executives is going to be part of the story, because it used to be different. One of the things I give to my intro students in the philosophy, politics, and economics major, I teach the gateway course to the major. I share with them an article from, I think it was Forbes or Fortune magazine or something, from the 1950s, How a CEO Lives. And they profiled a CEO of some Connecticut corporation that was doing really well. And this is how he lived. He has a 4-bedroom house, 2-car garage. Whoa, the luxury. Right. And for vacation, he would take a little boat out to a lake and go fishing. Okay, like this is supposed to be like lap of luxury, when in fact, today it's sort of like, a lot of middle class, ordinary middle class. And if you actually run a consumer price index deflator on his salary, it turns out to be $400,000 a year. Okay, which is okay. I mean, it's nice. You can do plenty well. You have a totally comfortable standard of living at $400,000 a year. But of course, it's in $400,000 in today's dollars. But it's not like the, incredible, Jeff Bezos is what, like 170 something billion? I can't remember, 180 billion, right? I mean, it's just off the charts. Nobody needs that money. In fact, they can't even spend it all. Why are they even accumulating it? I really think, like, have they given any critical thought to what's the point of making more? Why does Jeff Bezos have to squeeze his workers so he could make another billion? What is this? It seems obsessive and irrational. And to a certain degree, I think it's just because it's a steam competition here with his fellow CEOs, and the money becomes unreal. But it's kind of like the point system. Well, but you could measure esteem in other terms. And if you look back in the 50s, in this time that Jerry Davis is talking about, when corporations were big and employed a lot of people, CEOs took pride in the fact that their corporations were big and employed a lot of people. And so a lot of people became prosperous, as a result of their management of these, conglomerates, right? You could change the economy of esteem. People don't have to, after a certain point, the money just starts piling up without you even having to make much effort anymore. And the efforts that I document in my book about, private equity, they're really just extracting wealth. They're destroying wealth. They're destroying people's livelihoods and just grabbing it all for themselves. It's exactly like the enclosure movements in England, where, you get 30,000 landowners that own everything just because they took it for themselves. Why? Because they control Parliament. It's not so hard if you can run, who's getting the handouts? Well, they're just awarding it to themselves. But we could change that. There's nothing, even a few decades ago, CEOs had a different economy of esteem, and we should change that. It should be a source of shame that you have billions of dollars. How nobody could possibly make that amount of money, honestly. They had to be screwing over other people to pile all that up for themselves.
Dr. Anderson, could I just pipe in here? You know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, I don't know when, in the last year, you know, no one can make $1 billion. You have to take $1 billion.
Yeah. That's absolutely correct.
It's a great phrase, but I'm curious if it's more than just piling up the money. And I just Citizens United jumped to mind. And it seems that there's a growing political infrastructure that encourages, would encourage an individual like Bezos or anybody else to seek more, because the tendency appears to be that money is citizenship, money is participation, money is political power, not just luxury.
Well, so here's the thing. I agree with you entirely that it's not just luxury, because the truth is that it doesn't take a lot of money to live in the lap of luxury. And anybody with $1 billion, the reality is they can't spend it on themselves. It's impossible to spend that much money on yourself. Think about it. Okay, you buy a $300 million mansion, but how many of those could you actually consume, right? You have 365 of them and you wouldn't even notice the dent in Jeff Bezos's net worth. And then he spends one day in each of these mansions per year. You know, it's like, then your all of your time is spent just moving from one to the next. It makes no sense, right? It takes time to consume. And the one thing that we all have equally is equal amount of time per year, right? 24/7. Like the rich can't buy more hours in a day or more days in a year, right? They can get a longer lifespan, but and they do have a longer lifespan, but still, you know, at the end of life, you're already retired. At any rate, so yes, power is also at issue here, but then you got to ask, like, what do they want power? And you know, I really come back to Rousseau in his discourse on the origins of inequality. It all comes back to the ego trip of having more, and sort of competitive esteem competition, because what's the point? And even Smith had the same observation in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He talks about an advisor to the king who asks him what the king's plans are, and the king says, "Yeah, I'm going to like go out and lead an army and conquer all these places." And you know, what will your highness do after conquering all these places? And you know, and the king says, "Well, after I do this, I'm just going to like enjoy some ale with my friends, and you know, before a comforting fire, and you know, we'll just have a nice time together." And his advisor says, "But what's stopping you from doing that now?" What, you don't need all this power. I do think that in a way, the way we've configured our economy of esteem is really empowering like sociopaths, people who just like have no concept of what a fulfilling life would be, and or maybe they're like narcissists, right? Like lacking an inner core, the only thing they can go after is like people worshiping them. Right? There are other ways to live. I mean, it's not an accident that whenever philosophers have reflected on the good life, and you know, they've asked, well, it's like piling up a lot of money, like, is that part of the good life? And I don't know a single philosopher who's ever said yes to that. If you actually like reflect, it really doesn't make any sense. There must be addressing some other sort of psychic need that would be better addressed by other means than like just rolling a juggernaut over thousands of people, just get more and more for yourself.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Professor Anderson? I think you're hitting it exactly right. And, you know, we could probably come up with half a dozen very quick policy proposals that would mitigate the scenario that you're describing and the grotesque accumulation of wealth. What strikes me as important is, you know, you're right. A few generations ago, CEOs took it as a point of pride in a somewhat different way, maybe not across the board 100%, but, you know, as a generalization, the fact that, you know, marginal tax rates were significantly higher, that the sort of structure of the economy was different, certainly mattered. But what seems to me is that in the last 50 years, it's not just the sociopaths and the narcissists who are the beneficiaries of this system that support it, but rather that there's a very broad-based sense of legitimacy among the general public, and speaking of the United States' political culture, but it may be elsewhere in the world as well, that says that, what Todd said, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said is not actually a popular view. And that the overwhelming kind of cultural norm is that if one is making the money, one has earned the money, right? That the market speaks, and then we all just sort of do what it says. And so if Jeff Bezos is worth $180 billion, it must be that he is I can't do the math, 180 million times better at his job than I am.
Yeah, well, that's why I think we actually have to publicize the details of how these people make their money and at whose expense, right? A lot of it is because, like, the conservative work ethic, it's so deeply ingrained to think that, if you're rich, it must be because, like, you produced or contributed. But that's an ideology, and it's really, if you look at the details of how the super rich really make their money, you see massive abuses of power here. And to a certain degree, I think that is filtering out. Look at how the Sacklers made their money by getting hundreds of thousands of people addicted to opioids. Like, everyone knows that that's totally corrupt, right? And I do think that there is a kind of something of a turn of public opinion. And the more we expose how the rich make their money and how predatory the techniques are, the more we can discredit this and make it an object of contempt rather than esteem. It's one of the reasons why I don't believe in non-disclosure agreements. I think people, you got to have protection for workers who spill all the beans on how corrupt these corporations are. And right now, like, whistleblower protections are empty and worthless. We got to have a better system because the public needs to know how abusive so many of these practices are.
Secrecy is playing a huge role in sustaining this system.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I know that we could keep everyone here talking for hours and hours. I do want to bring up one final question and hear everyone's response to it that was raised by Jonathan Gerard, which is a question about action. So he writes, how do we get from the we should shift to a new work ethic to the we will? So I would love to hear, I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but I would love to hear from each one of you about what important first steps you think there are to actually making this actionable.
Well, I'm a philosopher, so don't consult me on how to accomplish anything practical in the real world. And this may be equally pie in the sky to anything else that someone might say, but I might suggest working on the social attitudes first, which can be done in part through cultural products, TV shows, books, articles, podcasts can have a powerful effect on sort of our social perceptions and valorizations. And we might optimistically hope that when social attitudes change, pressure to implement the kinds of institutional changes that would be required would follow, because we do live hypothetically in a democracy.
I can't do much better than rhetoric either. One of the things that I loved about the project was that in splitting the work ethic into two opposing, also complementary parts, the conservative and the progressive, you've discovered and highlighted a really powerful apparatus for moving worker dignity and reformed and regulated models of capitalism forward that is already inside of our capitalist ideology. And so I really look forward to, how the book comes out and is received and is picked up by the, by the commentariat especially in moderate, moderate conservative circles. And if, we can join you in helping to rewrite or to pull out and help to cultivate some of those progressive tropes, progressive strategies. I'm excited about the first few years of this book's rollout.
Yeah, I think similarly, like it's a mix of the structural changes and the attitudes. I think that they're both very important. Reading the part of the works that I did read, I thought a lot about my experience as a worker and how I worked in a grocery store and I made 3 times what I'm making now as a grad student, but I feel like I have more esteem for being a grad student than I did being a grocery store mid-level manager. And I could have, if I was a store manager at the grocery store I was working, I could have made 3 figures there. But the esteem of being a grocery store manager is not the esteem of being, probably even like an adjunct professor. And so I think that there's like the structural changes of paying people for work, but I think that that doesn't go with the social recognition of like the work being valuable. Then the meaningfulness won't just come from the pay. And similarly, inspired by your book, I was researching like how many Americans don't take their vacation days. So even like giving people vacation days alone isn't going to actually change whether or not they take those vacation days. Like there's like millions and millions and millions of dollars of unused vacation days in America a year. And so I think the structural changes definitely need to be hand in hand with changes in attitude towards work.
I think one thing that might bridge the gap between rhetoric and maybe policy or political action is finding ways to encourage a more open conversation about compensation and pay and expectations. And it's always struck me that American culture has this bizarre and somewhat unusual in other parts of the world fixation on not talking about how much money people are paid. And it gets litigious. Obviously, in cases where people don't know they're being discriminated against in wages. And I'm always reminded of 20 years ago or so, I was teaching English to a person in France in their workplace, and the debate at the time was I think it was John Kerry's proposal to raise taxes on people who made more than $200,000 a year, or in the top 1% of the income earners. And somebody did a survey of American voters and said, are you in the top 1% of income earners? And something like 19% said they were, and another 20% said they expected to be in their lifetime. And that tells you that 39% of people have absolutely 38% have no idea what it means to be in the top 1%. And so we push back when somebody says, I'm going to raise taxes on the wealthy. And we don't talk about salaries. We don't talk about how much people make. You talk about how much Bezos makes, but nobody can wrap their head around $180 billion.
Yeah.
We don't talk about, what, they throw the figure around about, a CEO makes X number of times more than the average worker. But because we don't talk about that, we don't have a sense of what it would actually mean to tax people who make $250,000 a year more. And then you get somebody mouthing off of the Wall Street Journal that says 300 grand a year is a low salary, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a way to encourage a public discourse that is more honest about what work brings, that might, allow us to reshape how we discuss publicly the work ethic.
Yeah. So another part of my work investigates social movements in relation to the abolition of slavery. And I think there's no substitutes for people marching in the streets. Right? I mean, ordinary people don't have the money, but they do have the numbers. And that has to be shown. Because basically, what's weird about social arrangements, they're all really the products of a certain kind of social contract, in the sense that institutions are all upheld by the consent or acquiescence, which could be coerced, of the people who reproduce those social systems and those social norms and institutions. The people collectively can change this. Okay, but in order to do that, right, they have to come out in numbers and say, this is wrong. We insist on a change in the social contract. So there's no substitute for that. And of course, you know, I mean, that's theoretically, if we perfect our democracy, that's a vehicle through which to effect change. But there's no substitute for just getting out in the streets and like demonstrating to the public at large that huge masses of people won't take it anymore, and that change is critical. And if you get the critical feature of a social movement is it can disrupt ordinary habits and get like people in power to realize that things can't go on as they have before. And that means it has to be disrupted. So the kinds of constraints we're seeing passed in certain states to repress assembly, public assembly and protests, demonstrations are extremely dangerous because they are critical agents of social change, and that's why they want them to be suppressed. But part of it also, we have to address this fear that people have, which is coming entirely from this, you know, conservative perspective that I'm getting my position, like it's all positional, right? As soon as you start thinking of politics entirely in terms of a gain for these people beneath me is a loss to me personally, then democracy is gone, okay? You got to get people thinking out of the zero-sum kind of frame of mind. And if we look at contemporary political discourse on the right, it's all entirely zero sum. Oh, these immigrants, it's like they're threatening you. They're going to bring you down. Or, you know, that zero sum thinking is at the core of racism and so forth. But it's helpful, you know, for people to recall, for instance, the actual economic effect of the civil rights movement, and in particular, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended racial segregation of public accommodations and put pressure on employers to hire on a non-discriminatory basis. It hasn't been fully realized, but still a lot things changed. The economist Gavin Wright has done an economic history of the impact of the civil rights movement on the economy of the South. And what he found is whites and blacks gained alike. You know, the Southern economy took off, whereas it was just kind of totally stagnant before then, right? And it makes sense, you know, from an economic point of view. You open up opportunities to a lot of people who've been closed down, and you're going to, you know, improve economic growth, right? And so you got to get people off this idea that again, to, you know, the people beneath them is a loss to themselves. And that's something that, you know, when you, especially when you march together in solidarity in racially inclusive groups, it can help people change minds. And we saw that in the civil rights movement. We're seeing it now in Black Lives Matter. It's important that these marches are inclusive, and that people, you know, whites too are coming to see that this zero-sum thinking, you know, is unjust, and that it's, you know, hanging on to white privilege is really screwing everybody over.
Well, thank you, Dr. Anderson, for those closing thoughts. And thank you to all of our panelists for this conversation. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. And this is a bittersweet moment because under normal circumstances, if this were a normal Adams Symposium, we would now be slowly making our way towards the coffee table and we could continue the conversation for as long as we liked. But I hope that everyone here today will leave with more curiosity than you came with, and we'll keep this conversation going. One way, if you did enjoy today's conversation and you'd like to take part in more events like this, I do want to highlight a few upcoming events. We've got a seminar on the Olympic Games with Matt Andrews coming up at the end of this month. And then on May 22nd, we're going to be kicking off our summer series with a public free event on Black power and poetry that will feature a number of talented local voices. Now I'd like to invite Lloyd Kramer back on here to offer some closing thoughts, but thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Hello, and thank you very much, Joanna. And I don't have a lot of thoughts, but I do feel a deep appreciation for what everyone has contributed to this. And I want to thank Carl Adam and Jill Adams also for helping us understand how this kind of conversation exemplifies the traditions that Maynard Adams represented and advocated for in establishing Carolina Public Humanities over 40 years ago. And I think the great thing we've seen in this conversation is how we cannot possibly understand contemporary issues like work or economic policies without history, without philosophy, without understanding religious traditions, without understanding ethics, and without having conversations. And we thank Elizabeth Anderson for coming into our community and provoking more conversations. And I wish we had solved all these problems, but we have taken an essential step forward in the spirit of the Adams Symposium. So thank you, and thanks to Max and to Joanna and to all the participants who've been part of this discussion. And we hope to see all of you again at another event. Thank you.
Thank you.